We are not, right now, doing a history of Palestinians or Palestine. We are going through a sort of hop, skip, and jump through some of these themes and ideas as Palestinians, as significant figures who develop these ideas, start to talk about them. And that brings us to Haj Amin. Haj Amin is the son of Kamil, the son of the Mufti, made by the British the Grand Mufti when the British take over. Haj Amin inherits the title of Grand Mufti. Haj Amin also is the student of Rashid Rida. So he's already a little bit primed to think of the Palestine problem as a problem of, what's Rashid Rida's fundamental problem? The Jews and therefore Islamic honor. And Haj Amin's great problem is that the Arabs of Palestine don't understand that they are actually fighting a much larger fight, which is a fight for Islamic honor. It's hard to say liberation, because it really depends liberation from who? He is a very close collaborator with the British Empire. He was very happy under the Ottoman Empire and is sad it fell, right? So he's not talking about nationalism in exactly that way. The problem is the Jews, but not simply the Jews. They aren't anti-Semites just for, by the way, that's what it feels like to the Jews, and that's how it should feel like to the Jews. But the Jews are a specific problem, and the problem is if we're losing to the Jews, that is how pathetic we are, that is how weak we are. And so he needs to awaken them. In 1920, he starts a riot, standing at Al-Aqsa Mosque, over the sanctity of Al-Aqsa Mosque, over the sanctity of Jerusalem, against the Jews. In 1929, he helps spark that riot, and it is again defined as a religious violence against the Jews for violating Al-Aqsa. He wants this to be what? The Jewish-Arab encounter in Palestine needs to become, in his view, holy war, or a war for Islamic dignity and honor and restoration. And Haj Amin really tracks that history of Imperial Britain and Zionism. In 1917, the British government issues the Balfour Declaration. If you are an Arab in Palestine, what does that feel like? The intellectual elites, what does that feel like?
It feels sad.
What does that feel sad for? Why is that sad? What happens in 1917 in Palestine?
Like you have this land.
Who are the British if you are a Palestinian Arab in 1917?
They're the occupiers.
They are
Occupiers.
the...
They're the strongest empire.
What war is underway? World War I. And who's in control at the beginning of World War I? And who's in control at the end of World War I? And therefore 1917 is the year of the conquest. And so the British are the new. So this is a problem. Right? Why is this a problem? They're not just the new. They are so vastly more powerful than the pathetic Muslim empire that has been defeated, that itself could not stop Zionism from taking root. And then the Balfour Declaration comes like a thunderbolt. And in the face of the Balfour Declaration, it's not just the Balfour Declaration, it gets very complicated. There's the San Remo Conference in 1923, in which the Arab League gathers at San Remo and starts to talk about the Jews getting this land as the Jewish state, as the solution to the Jewish problem. Also in light of the Balfour Declaration, who is not invited to the San Remo Conference? Don't be scared to guess. What? The Palestinian Arab elites. And so the Western empires, the Jews begin their entry into the land as agents of who? The Tsar they're running away from. By 1917, the new conqueror declares with trumpets and flags that the Jewish national home, not a state, but a national home, what the heck is that? They won't say. Ambiguity is not in your favor if you're a Palestinian Arab right now and the British just conquered the place. At least you don't think so. The Jews, by the way, were also not so excited about the ambiguity. And then San Remo, you're not even invited. Things escalate. In 1921, what does America do? We talked about it on Thursday. Immigration quotas. In 1921, 110, 20,000 Jews land in New York Harbor. By 1924, how many Jews land in New York Harbor? 10,000. And by 1934, that was the number I had up there? 2,700. And so America is closing its doors. The West is closing its doors. Where are the Jews starting to go in massive numbers? Until 1921, you thought you had a problem. In 1935 alone, 65,000 German-speaking Jews land in Palestine. Just in 1935. Now the problem really becomes a problem. Because hundreds of thousands are coming because they're running desperately away from a Europe that is literally becoming uninhabitable to them and where they are being slaughtered and kicked out of universities and being disenfranchised. Yes?
Who was the one who was organizing the San Remo conference and did the Palestinian elite?
I don't want to get into it, but Wikipedia is your friend. Seriously, look it up, read about it. It's fascinating, it's important. San Remo figures very big in right-wing Israeli Jewish discourse because that's when the League of Nations just said, it's all yours, you're done. And it also figures kind of big in Palestinian sort of advocacy discourse because that's where the West, as it colonialized, not colonized, colonialized, which is a little different, and imperialized, I'm using those as verbs now, just decided it can tell the Arabs what's happening to them, right? So it figures a bit. Read about it, go into it. Where was I? We have a massive outburst of violence in 1929, the first really major one. There was in 1920. In 1929, it's big. The massacre of the Jews of Hebron. And folks, we are headed into, and orchestrated, organized, also by Haj Amin, and now we are headed into a real clash. Palestinian elites are convinced by the 1930s that Zionism is the handmaiden of British imperialism. Are they convinced that Zionism is part of British imperialism because they're stupid and don't know that we're refugees? Yes.
Sorry, I just noticed that slowly we've been transitioning from Arab elites to Palestinian elites.
Hold on one second. The correct answer is no. Yes. As you were saying.
We haven't been doing that?
Sure.
So was there a known shift in
Roughly in 1910, they start talking about themselves as Palestinian elites. The world calls the land Palestine and the people Arab. Palestinians call the land Palestine and the people Arab. And then you suddenly, in 1914, have a newspaper in Jaffa called Palestine. And then they begin more and more to use the concept of Palestine. It's not an accident that the newspaper Palestine and the other major Palestinian nationalist newspaper of 1914, Al-Karmil in Haifa, it's not an accident that both of them are put out by Christian Arabs. And so it's, in other words, people who think of Palestine the way Jews think of Palestine, of the land of Israel. And so it begins, it percolates. By the 1930s, it's pretty common. By the 1960s, it's everybody, but it is very much, you don't have to call them Palestinians if you don't want to. It doesn't really change much. They're certainly not Jews, so they're someone else, right? So, yes?
So you mentioned Islamic Torah previously. When did the discourse of Ummah and Muslim take place? Was it always there?
I mean, it's already in Rashid Rida. He already talks about, did I cut that part? Oh, okay, so continuing that quote, later in the paragraph that I cited and then cut in half, he says, and your ummah and your, he talks about ummah, he talks about watan, the homeland, and he also talks about ummah, the nation, by which Islam talks about itself as a nation, which using the word ummah, but it means not nationalism nation, but Islam as a nation, right? So he talks about it literally in that quote. It's always been there in the theory. I mean, I'm not enough of an expert to answer that question with any precision, but it's certainly there in Rashid Rida. And it's certainly there in Rashid Rida's teachers. So 150 years, at least, where that kind of discourse as a response to modern Western imperialism is absolutely there. It's rich, it exists, there's newspapers, there's journals talking about it in the Arab world.
How did you like the Holy War view of it? Was it not successful in the beginning and then arise later on, or
Meaning what?
the Ummah Muslim fight for the land
It coalesces among Arab Muslim intellectuals as a response to the rising imperialism of the Western states. In other words, Britain and France take Ottoman lands France is already in Algeria in 1830. Britain's already in Egypt in, I think, 1860 or something like that. And then the Sykes-Picot after the war. In 17, Britain's already in control of Palestine. In 23, Sykes-Picot splits what had been the promised Arab sort of nation state, the unified Arab state promised by the British to Faisal and others, is now split up between the British and French zones of control, which become Syria, Lebanon in the north, and Iraq, Jordan, Israel in the south, etc. As that expands, discourse about an ummah and a grand Islamic response becomes center stage in Arab intellectual life. By the way, it's one of the solutions to the great problem. Other solutions are Arab nationalism. Other solutions, there are many, many different discourses as a response to this massive infiltration of European imperialism. And then begins, folks, the Arab Revolt. The Arab Revolt is very much led by Haj Amin. But it's actually sparked by someone more interesting than Haj Amin, Izz ad-Din al-Qassam. You might be familiar with the name Izz ad-Din al-Qassam. It is the namesake of Hamas's military brigades and of their most famous rocket. Izz ad-Din al-Qassam is a preacher in Haifa who begins to found what we today would call, I guess, jihadi resistance groups. Little ones. Groups of 15 guys in Qalqilia. Groups of, some tiny organization coming out of Haifa. And he begins to, and he's two interesting things. One, he comes from the lower classes. He's not part of these elite families. And that's important. Because if you're Palestinian, one of the recurring themes of Palestinian history is that these elite families, like the Ottoman imperial edifice that preceded them, what are they responsible for? What did they do?
Not address the Jews right when it was started.
Not address the Jews. That's not but what if you're Palestinian? What do you think of the elite family, the Husseinis and the Nashashibis and all the others, the Khalidis? Yes. Their basic legacy is failure, catastrophic failure. And Izz ad-Din al-Qassam is a preacher, and he preaches to these very pious communities, essentially of workers, of laborers, including construction workers, including port workers. And he preaches to them, and he says to them, the solution is not going to come from the elites. The solution is going to come from Islamic piety, and it's going to come from holy war, and it's going to come from specifically the kind of holy war in the 1930s that we would later come to call essentially anti-colonial terrorism. And he begins launching these terror attacks in 1936 that very quickly expand into massive violence. Jews are killed in Jaffa. The British, over the next 3 years, are going to rush troops to Palestine, and they're going to embark on a massive campaign to suppress this, what the Palestinians come to call the Great Arab Revolt of 1936 to 39. The Great Arab Revolt of 36 to 39 at the leadership level is led by Haj Amin in different ways. The British then exile him, but it is sparked by this religious idea. And it is sparked by this religious framework. And over the course of 1936 to 39, the British suppress, sometimes brutally, the Palestinian uprising, and the British for the first time give permission, give support, give training sometimes to Jews to begin to found, to the Zionist movement and to the Yeshuv, to begin to found Jewish military organizations. The Jews enter 1936 without standing military organizations of any value, and they leave 1939 with standing military organizations that have a real training, real hierarchies, and real capabilities. The Great Arab Revolt is suppressed by the British, and the Jews emerge from it much, much more powerful. Their estimates, wonderful book on this by Oren Kessler, 1936, I think he called it, about this revolt, about the history of the revolt. You must read it. You don't have a choice not to read it. And I believe it's also an audiobook, so don't work hard. And one of the fascinating things is if you're a Palestinian and you're watching the events of the Great Revolt, what does it look like? Who actually suppressed you? The Jews? The Jews start basically disarmed. They end well armed. Who suppressed you? And armed the Jews? The British. And the suppression was massive. Expelled and killed were probably 10% of the fighting age men of the Palestinian Arab society. 1936 to 39 was suppressed so powerfully by the British that by the time Palestinian society gets to 1948, its fighting capacity is much reduced. Its ability to have a proper fight while the Jews are arming and arming and arming and arming in that intervening decade is is much lower than it would have been. And who did that to you?
The British.
The British. And so the Zionists are literally now armed. Zionist weapons are literally supplied and built and trained by the British Empire. Is Zionism the handmaiden of British imperialism? Why would you attack the British in 36 to 39 when they're still extremely powerful, a world-spanning empire, and capable of surging to your country 100,000 troops? Why would you attack the British? Because you think, what? That Zionism is ultimately an arm of British imperialism. Why? Because of San Remo. Why? Because of Balfour. And if you're the Jews, what are you watching the Palestinians do? Yeah. Why would you attack the British now? We don't want the British here. But don't attack them now. How much dumber can you get? Because when the British leave, we're still here. Don't spend all of your military power in a war on the British that can't work. We're still here. 36 to 39 is a massive Palestinian loss, catastrophe. One of the reasons Palestinians don't really know about 36 to 39 is that it was a self-inflicted disaster. And it was a real disaster. Haj Amin actually kills some of the leaders of the other families, of the Nashashibis, who want to take a different strategy and a different path in 1937 during the uprising. And so it is a choice made by Palestinian society with an internal debate, and it is a catastrophe for Palestinians. And one of the interesting points that Oren Kessler makes is that there aren't really all that many Palestinian history books that even talk about 36 to 39. Because then you'd have to face the self-made disaster, the self-made strategic blunder that may have already settled 48 back in 36. But it is bad enough for the British. The revolt is bad enough. It is expensive enough. It is difficult enough that in 1939, after suppressing the Palestinian Arab revolt, what does the British Empire do? Yes?
They passed the white paper.
The White Paper. And what does the White Paper do in 1939?
They placed a constructive massive cap on Jewish immigration.
It essentially seals Jewish immigration to a tiny trickle into the land of Israel, just in time in 1939 for a tiny little event that we call, folks, if you're a Jew, the White Paper is a catastrophe. But it's also an absolute validation of the basic premise. What's the premise? The world is uninhabitable to us. There is no other choice. And the British are our enemy just as much as anyone else. If you're a Palestinian, what does 1939 for about 10 minutes look like? A massive success. It looks like a massive success. Why does Haj Amin, over the course of World War II, side with the Nazis?
Getting rid of the problem.
What?
Getting rid of the problem.
They are enemies of the British.
For the same reason, the Rashid Ali regime rises in Baghdad. The Nazis are anti-British. That doesn't mean they're not anti-Semitic. The Haj Amin and Rashid Ali and all those guys, they're anti-Semitic, but the strategy is to be anti-British, and therefore you're pro-Nazi. So pro-Nazi that you will, in fact, in 1935, I think, the German embassy in Jerusalem is now a Nazi embassy, flying a Nazi flag over Jerusalem. And the elites led by Haj Amin, invite the Nazi ambassador to an event at Nebi Musa, this holy site in the desert down by Jericho, and they have a whole conference with him. And they wine and dine the guy, and they express this support, beginning in the mid-30s. By the time World War II comes around and Haj Amin is in Berlin or training Muslim battalions in Croatia to serve in the Nazi war effort, by the time that's happening, he's already been on the Nazi side for years and years and years. And the Nazis also see Palestine's Jews as part of the problem. They actually establish an Einsatzgruppen in Egypt, called the Einsatzgruppe in Ägyptum, for some reason in Latin. And they have plans for the Jews of Palestine. And Rommel's push east in North Africa has plans for the Jews of Palestine. And Palestinian Arab leaders, including Haj Amin, are very excited about those plans. And then what happens? Who saves the Jews?
Well, they stop them.
Who saves the Jews?
Jews, sort of.
Who saves the Jews from Rommel's push east? The Allies where? The British where? At El Alamein, in the Battle of El Alamein. Now the problem with the Battle of El Alamein for the Jews is that it doesn't quite fit the Zionist narrative. Because what if the Nazis had won and the British had been kicked out of Egypt and then the Nazis are just walking to Palestine? What would happen to the Jews? Would Zionism have saved the Jews? Who ended up saving the Zionist project after already turning its back on the Zionist project, funneling the Jews essentially into Auschwitz, and then saving Palestinian Jewry by stopping the Nazis in Egypt? Who ended up doing that? Imperial Britain. So how much do we teach our kids about the great battle of El Alamein, in which Imperial Britain saved the Zionist project that we're definitely sure was the only thing that saved Jews, despite Britain turning its back? Everybody, one second. Everybody with me? It's not a story we tell ourselves, and so it's hard to hear it from us if you're Palestinian. Yes?
I guess I'm still not understanding why the Arab revolt wouldn't play into, or maybe I'm not understanding the Palestinian narrative, why they wouldn't talk about it. Because it seems like if you want to say, well, what Israel is, right, Zionism is sort of this colonial project, you'd show, like, this would be the perfect example to show how they're intertwined. Why would you avoid, like, this sort of moment where you
absolutely.
say, clearly the British are on the Arab
they
side,
absolutely,
on the Jewish side.
They absolutely use it to show the intertwining of Western imperial interests and Zionism. What they don't do is talk about any Palestinian decisions or actions, and they don't teach the event in general, because then you got to look at some of the Palestinian actions. There's literally Aaron went looking, and there's a professor at I think the Open University, Arab-Israeli professor, who quotes in the book saying there just aren't books in Arabic on the Great Revolt. We don't want to talk about it as a society, Palestinian society, because so many of the decisions made were so catastrophic, and it also puts 1948 in a different light. It is more a Palestinian self-made catastrophe than it would otherwise have been, and so we just don't talk about it. Just like the Jews don't talk about El Alamein, or the Jews don't talk about the refugee experience. And so when I give that talk that I gave on Thursday to Israelis, 19-year-old Israelis in pre-military academies about to go into the army, who are the best of the best, coming from the best high schools and headed to the best universities, and along the way there's something like 50 pilots that I once taught this stuff in pre-military academies over the last 10 years. They don't know that either. They don't know the things you don't know, because it's not the simple Zionist story, and so it's hard to stick it into the curriculum. Yes?
Why isn't it the simple Zionist story? Isn't the simple Zionist story that nobody cared about us until we never know how?
There is literally a debate of Israeli and Zionist sociologists. A guy named Leszczynski, Jewish, from the 1940s, who's a sociologist, and he's one of the great sociologists working on Jews and Jewish migration in the 1940s, and he writes extensively about this problem of why aren't the Jews coming to the land of Israel. It's very embarrassing that they're not coming to the land of Israel until they have no choice. And he's a Zionist, and the Zionists don't want to talk about it, but why didn't they? And he has these beautiful lines like, the large river of migration is people whose sole desire is to make money. And that's why all of these refugees are headed to America. But there is a pure, if narrow, but nevertheless pure stream of migration that has national honor and comes to the blah, 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 blah. So that's a problem. Kudos to him for noticing the problem, but it's a problem that is untalked about by the Zionists because it's supposed to be ideological and not refugees. And when they have somewhere else wealthier, higher GDP per capita, better prospects to go to, they take their families there. I don't know why we don't talk about it, and I suspect we don't talk about it because socialists ran Zionism for a long time. People very used to ideological explanations and constructs for every single thing in history ran Zionist ideas and institutions for a very long time. But that's Herzl. Herzl is worried about a catastrophe. Herzl's idealizing of the Zionist enterprise and the Jewish state that is to come is very secondary. There's going to be an opera in the new Jewish state, but that's not really the point. The point is rescue. The point is catastrophe. I showed you guys the quote, what he told the Rothschilds on Thursday. The point is rescue. And so it's not Zionism. It is Zionism. That is absolutely Zionism. It's rescue. Rescuing the Jews is the big thing we did. Everything else was, but tell that to a 1940s socialist. I actually have this wonderful little letter from Tebenkin to Yigal Allon, this intellectual of the Mapam movement, the more communist of the socialist movements in the early years of the state, to Yigal Allon, the great general and the minister from Mapam. In 1960, I think, he went shopping on Fifth Avenue in America, and he comes back to Israel, and he writes a letter to Yigal Allon, and it's something like, it's in the biography of Yigal Allon by Anita Shapira, and in this letter he writes, I'm not so sure capitalism is collapsing. I just have to tell you, I know we know it is, I know it's guaranteed to be, I'm just not so sure it is, right? And it's like, it's an astonishing letter but anyway, so there's this ideological, there's this addiction to ideological constructs. Incidentally, American universities are addicted to ideological constructs. One of the reasons you don't know your own damn story is that the only thing anyone ever teaches American young people is ideological constructs. Teach the ordinary social history of the Jews and you will learn a lot more about who you are. You'll learn a lot more about Zionism. You can't move millions of people, except by force, with ideological constructs.